Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to this wonderful workshop, and I'm really looking forward to see the pictures of Käthe Buchler. I only saw a couple of them on the internet, but John told me that there are many more pictures, so this will be a great thing. And also yesterday with Arsenal. So I'm suffering still a bit of it, but so please excuse my mistakes. I'm not perfect in English. I'd like to begin with this picture that was painted by Käthe Kollwitz, German's Children Are Starving. Käthe Kollwitz, you may know, was a well-known artist, and she responded to the experiences of the war in a very different way than Käthe Buchler. An exhibition of Käthe Buchler's images in 2012 in Germany was called Between Idyll and Homefront. Though her pictures show the everyday life in Germany between 1914 and 18, her pictures reveal a more or less peaceful and as well an industrial atmosphere. In all, I think she was more interested to show women working in men's jobs or women working in charity jobs rather than revealing the despair and the starving situations of people in Germany during World War I, as Käthe Kollwitz did. The different perceptions probably result from the varying experiences. Käthe Buchler was married into a wealthy business family at Brunswick and was active in the Red Cross. Brunswick is a middle-sized town. It had about 100,000 inhabitants at that time and was surrounded by very fertile lands, while Käthe Kollwitz lived in Berlin. The nutritional situation varied very much during the war. Food supply was particularly low in large cities like Berlin. For inhabitants of the large cities often could not supplement their food rations, unlike those in the smaller towns or even in the countryside. They had their gardens, they could grow vegetable and perhaps keep chicken. Moreover, Käthe Kollwitz lost her only son in the very early months of the war, and she suffered much from his death. So both women had very different lifestyles and experiences during the war. It may be remarked that by the time of the outbreak of World War I, a global economy existed which also included the distribution and supply of food. Pre-war Germany was a large importer of agricultural products and fertilizers. It imported about a third of its foodstuff and fertilizers. Thus, international maritime trade was of paramount importance to Germany's economic survival. When Germany entered war in 1914, it was expected that the war would not last long, but that it would be over before the end of the war. Thus, the German Reich was badly or not at all prepared when Britain declared the blockade and closed the North Sea in November 1914. After the announcement of the unlimited U-boat war in February 1915, Britain tightened the blockade, and from that time onwards hardly any imports arrived. All shipping traffic to and from the German ports as well as to and from the neutral ports was interrupted. Negotiations with neutral powers, with the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries and Switzerland had the aim to stop the import of overseas goods to Germany via these neutral countries. The blockade had very adverse effects on the German agriculture. Before the war, Germany had an intensive agriculture with yields among the highest in the world, achieved by a large input of labor and fertilizers. Most of these nitrogenous and phosphatic fertilizers came from South America, especially from saltpeter from Chile. The lack of saltpeter caused declining yields and poorer seeds. Livestock manure does not have the same good results as fertilizing with saltpeters. Moreover, livestock manure also decreased, and consequently fodder was less and less available. German historical literature divides food supply during World War I into two periods, from 1914 to 1916 and 1916 to 1918, or 19 even. The first period is characterized by food adjustments to war conditions, while the second period is characterized by extreme food scarcity, malnutrition and hunger. I will only touch the first period very briefly and focus on the second period. During the first period, the German government was occupied to centralize food supply and to get enough food for the army. Shortly after the beginning of the war, the government therefore introduced ration cards and established central institutions, such as a central buying institution, a central war food office, and a variety of other institutions, for example, a central sugar and a central cocoa office. Self-supply was strictly forbidden. By 1916, German population was surviving on a meager diet of dark bread, slices of sausages without fat, which contained little or no meat, and an individual ration of about 3 pounds of potatoes per week. As the official food rations were really low and even decreased during the war, civilians turned to self-help. Immediately after the entry into war, food prices jumped, and whoever wanted to supplement his meager diet turned to the black market. Here they faced exorbitant prices. Although the government forbid self-help, urban inhabitants traveled into the countryside in search of food. Theft of potatoes and vegetables from the fields became widespread from the very beginning of the war. Local authorities often turned a blind eye on this form of self-help. Due to the small daily and insufficient official allowance of food, inhabitants, for example, of Cologne, started to order food from shops in Denmark and Sweden, and they wrote letters to Denmark, and from there parcels with food was sent to them. But this was soon forbidden by the authorities, and food parcels that did not carry a consular certificate were confiscated. All those who turned to the black market ran the risk of having their hard-won acquired food confiscated by the police. The Princess Evelyn Blücher, an English lady married to a German prince, lived in Germany during the war, and she mentioned in her diary the following nice and curious incident. She wrote, "The regulations as to smuggling the provisions are very strict, and a funny scene took place at the station in Breslau the other day. A well-dressed, dignified-looking lady appeared at the luggage room with the object of checking her trunk. Her florid mien and the obvious nervousness with which she hurried on to the porter to weigh her trunk aroused the suspicion of the station master. The trunk was promptly opened, and to the surprise of the amused onlookers, a whole pig was discovered in it. It was confiscated and sold in the town at the official price, to the great discomfiture of the stately lady." Similarly, The Stadtanzeiger, that was the local newspaper of Cologne, mentioned that the police confiscated 2 calves and a pig at the train station on March 1917. I come now to the second period. Germans consumed potatoes more than any other food. Consumption was enormous. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities, the country's level of potato production successfully met consumption requirements. Germany devoted about 1/5 of its cultivated land to potatoes and achieved a per acre yield that placed her within the vanguard of potato-producing countries. The official ration diet consisted mainly of bread and potatoes from 1914 onwards. Then, with the failure of the potato crop and the potato blight in 1916, people were forced to seek substitutes. And these were and the potatoes were more or less substituted by turnips. Particularly severe was the so-called turnip winter of 1916-17. The impact of the population was notable. During this period, the collective weight of the German population plummeted severely. Queuing for food and waiting for long hours in the cold to obtain some food or even to obtain ration cards became a common feature. I brought you 2 pictures here. This one is a communal kitchen, and people are waiting there to get a bit of soup because they couldn't get food otherwise. And this is said to be the longest queue in Münster. Münster is a town in Westphalia, and really people were waiting there for getting ration cards. Also, Princess Evelyn Blücher provides a very vivid impression of the effects of malnutrition at that time. Oh, sorry, this is another picture from Münster again. People were waiting to get some vegetables from the Netherlands. So this is Evelyn Blücher, and she mentioned about the malnutrition in 1916. We are all growing thinner every day, and the rounded contours of the German nation have become a legend of the past. We are all gaunt and bony now, and have dark shadows around our eyes. And our thoughts are chiefly taken up with wondering what our next meal will be. As turnips were more or less the only food available in abundance, turnips were eaten as ersatz, substitute potatoes. They were consumed in the morning as turnip jam, and for lunch and dinner they were fried, baked, cooked. They were fried as turnip steaks, and also used in soups. The most diverse recipes were published during that time, and an exhibition in the Mansion House of Berlin-Charlottenburg presented 90 different recipes of turnips. However, the Germans didn't like the turnips. They found the taste horrible. Inhabitants of Cologne complained about the unpleasant taste of the turnips. And this caused the Cologne newspaper, the Stadtanzeiger, to advise its readers, first, to cut the turnips the night before. Put the pieces into cold water overnight. The next morning they should dispose of the water, fill in fresh water, and cook the turnip until noon. Again they should pour away the cooking water. Then the article consumes, the horrible taste of the turnip is gone. But please imagine, no nutritions were left after that long cooking. From early on, the government had required that bread was processed with 20% potato flour. And this bread was called Kriegsbread, war bread. But in consequence of the terrible harvest in 1916, this directive directive could no longer be met with. Potatoes and rye were increasingly substituted with fodder turnips. Moreover, the deadly bread ration, which had been established at 220 gram in 1915, fell to 160 gram in 1917. As food became more and more scarce, the usual ingredients were increasingly replaced by surrogates. During the turnip winter of 1916-17, surrogates exploded. Butter was replaced by a product made of sugar, colors mixed with fermented milk. Butter powder was sold, which consisted mainly of sodium carbonate and starch flour. And a Hungarian vegetable butter was sold, which was made of red turnips, carrots, and spices. Sausages were often made not of meat, but of vegetables and animal waste. Food shortage was not restricted to the aforementioned basics. Popular drinks in Germany, for example, beer and coffee, were made of surrogates. The so-called Kriegsbier, war beer, rarely contained as much as 4% alcohol and was rather a chemical product which hardly had any malt in it. In Germany, coffee was very popular, and it was consumed in the morning, in the afternoon, and often even in the evening. The substitution of coffee beans with chicory, roasted barley, or acorns was not unknown before the war, but by 1916 coffee beans had more or less disappeared. Not only due to the blockade, but the few imports which still arrived were reserved for the army. And wherever cocoa or coffee beans were found, they were confiscated. During the war, even chicory became scarce, and people began to replace it by roasting fruit pips, walnut shells, maize or oat husks. And the local food inspection office in Düsseldorf mentioned in its report that coffee was made of the oddest substances which were unimaginable before the war. It mentioned that even onions of lilies were roasted and consumed as coffee surrogates. It also reported that cocoa powder was made of cocoa shells and even, quote, worthless coffee shells mixed with potato powder and sugar. The German population did not only suffer from food shortage, but increasingly also of other goods like clothes and shoes. In pre-war Germany, cotton came predominantly from the United States. But with the entry of the United States into war in 1917, these imports stopped. Mending clothes and even of rags became a major concern, and experiments to substitute clothes and shoes with products made of paper and other goods spread. I'd like to show you these pictures. This is here, she says, collecting nettle if you want clothes and thread. I'm not sure if you can read the words below. The first picture said, fabrics made out of paper yarn are not inferior to any other clothes in beauty and durability. And the second picture says, they offer a complete substitute for wool, cotton, linen and silk. And then under the third picture it said, we owe this our indefatigable, unique inventive spirit and to all our conquering enterprise. So that comes out of paper clothes. By 1916-17, the ration no longer provided even half the calories considered necessary for existence. Milk supplies steadily deteriorated throughout the war. That resulted not only from the increased animal slaughter. The cows were so emaciated that they not only produced a much reduced quantity of milk, but the milk was so fat-poor that it served as a fertile culture medium for tuberculosis. During war, mortality increased prodigiously, especially among children and elderly. Undernourishment, however, did not only affect the young and the elderly. Mortality amongst mothers was particularly high, as many bore the brunt of restricted rations in order to feed their children better. This is one of the very impressive pictures Käthe Kollwitz made, the mother who could not feed her child. A comparison of the mortality statistics of German women and English women demonstrates that the impact upon the Germans of the famine condition beginning as early as 1916 was very severe. We know that there was a worldwide food shortage during the wartime due to the drought everywhere. But in Germany, they were suffering especially because of the blockade. And I show you this table. You see the differences here from 1916 onwards. Death rate among Germans was 15.2, and in England it decreased to 11.7. Food supply did not even improve after the end of the war. The situation grew even worse as the blockade was not lifted until 1919. Conflicts among the Allies prevented the early lifting of the blockade. In 1918-1919, the German population was staggering between anarchy and starvation. And only the threat of a Bolshevik revolution finally led to the lifting of the blockade. And then I'd like to thank you for listening to my talk.